Hi, I'm Ari, I'm the Oak Witch, and today's video is going to be all the books I read in 2022. Oh, I'm so excited about this video. I've been excited about this all year, ever since I did my last video on this, which is all the books I read in 2021. You guys really loved that, so I'm really excited to bring you round two and go through every single witchy book I read this year. So last year was a bit insane. I read like 70 books or something, and wow, I just clearly had a lot of free time. This year, my life has changed quite drastically to where I was last year, and a lot busier basically. So I read less books than I did last year. I read probably around 23, I think, 20-ish books, which obviously is far less than what I read last year, but you know, I'm not like disappointed. I'm fine with it. I think so much happened this year that I just had other priorities. I just didn't have the time to read as much. But I still read some gems, so I want to show you them today. Same with the last video, I'm going to try not to be too in depth with these like reviews, me going through them, because they're not proper reviews. It's just a fun video going through all what I've read, and I'm sure I've already spoken about a lot of these books throughout my videos on this channel and on Patreon as well. So if you want to see more in-depth reviews, maybe check out my Patreon, but this is going to be very, very brief. So yeah, why don't we just jump right in? And the first book I read this year was A Broom at Midnight, 13 Gates of Witchcraft by Spirit Flight by Roger J. Horn. Now, like, I've spoken about this before on my channel, I know that I have, maybe when I did my Spirit Flight video, and I absolutely loved this book. I love Roger J. Horn. He's like probably my favourite author, and you know what, this was such a good book. This really like changed my Spirit Flight practice, which I do quite a lot of, because it is quite a tricky practice to learn, to get the hang of, and there's some really nice advice in here into how to actually help you in your Spirit Flight. So I would actually recommend this book. I've recommended it before, and I would give this like a 5-star rating. Absolutely loved it. The second book I read is The Devil's Plantation, East Anglian Law, Witchcraft and Folk Magic by Nigel G. Pearson. You guys may or may not know, I am from East Anglia. That's pretty much where I've lived my entire life, so I'm very much an East Anglian girly. And in terms of my witchcraft practice, it's definitely something which I focus more on in my folk magic, folk witchcraft. So when I saw this book existed, I had to buy it, I had to read it, and loved it. So good. There were so many interesting practices in here which were quite regional to East Anglia and never knew about before, so you know what? I really rate this quite highly. I love his style of writing, and if you are interested in English folk magic, or you're from East Anglia and you want to just know a little bit more about maybe plant magic or even just general folklore and like history, definitely recommend. The third book I read this year is Shades of Faith, Minority Voices in Paganism, edited by Crystal Blanton. So this is like an anthology, a collection of essays book, all about what it says on the title. It goes through the voices and experiences of minorities in the pagan community, and honestly it addresses a lot of stuff like obviously racism, it addresses problems with discrimination, stereotypes, and just people sharing their thoughts on stuff that they've experienced and what they don't like about the community and how we could maybe change it. And it was just really insightful, and I really recommend people to read this if you are interested. Well, just I recommend anyone to read this, because although it says paganism, I think it does broadly apply to not just pagan but general polytheist, witchcraft, magical and spiritual spaces. I think it can widely apply. A lot of these experiences, I'm sure, are shared amongst a lot of people, unfortunately, so definitely recommend this book. The next book I read this year, which I don't know what month we're in, but this must have been February, because we read this for book club on my Discord server, and it is The Crooked Path, An Introduction to Traditional Witchcraft by Keldin. So I saw this book floating around in people's recommendations list so much, and I was always intrigued, so I thought, you know what, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a traditional witch, though I don't care if people place that label on me. I ascribe more to folk witchcraft. But I think obviously there is some crossover, well, there is a lot of crossover, and I was really interested into sort of what a traditional 101 book was sort of like. Because a lot of the time I find more traditional folk witchcraft books, there isn't really a lot of like easy 101 guides. It's more like, because you're reading so much about old folk customs and regional folklore and history, that obviously isn't always able to be dulled down into like a 101 sort of beginner format. A lot of it is research, a lot of it is just practice, like handing down practices, like hereditary sort of customs passed down, word of mouth. Like a lot of it isn't really stuff you can just learn in a book. It's sort of practice. It's folk magic is magic of the people, not necessarily magic of the book. So like it is quite interesting when I do find sort of books that do go through folk witchcraft or like traditional witchcraft, which are heavy emphasis on folk magic. I always love absorbing and eating all of that up. So we read this for our book club. We had some minor caveats, but honestly, I think this is a great book. I think this is a great book for anyone who is interested in more traditional witchcraft, less sort of general or maybe Wicca focused witchcraft, and wants more of like a traditional flavour to their witchcraft. Then I would say, you know what, start with this, because I think Keldin does a really good job of boiling down the essential aspects of what traditional witchcraft is. So maybe the beliefs, the spirits involved, and the sort of practices, the history, and how it's quite heavily tied to Wicca, whilst also being distinct. Things like that. He goes through all those subjects and topics quite well. It's really easy to understand, and there's lots of practices in here which could get you sort of up and ready to go. I really liked this book actually, so yeah, definitely recommend this one. Following the theme, I ended up getting this book from, I can't remember where I got it from actually, but it is By Moonlight and Spirit Flight by Michael Howard. And it's basically an essay which Three Hands Press turned into like a book, I believe. I think, hopefully I've not got that wrong. But, you know, Michael Howard was a great historian, and I've read a few of his books and really liked them. And I thought I would go for this one. And it is very interesting going through this concept of the Witch's Sabbath, of Spirit Flight. And you can tell that at this point in the year I was just obsessed with things traditional and Spirit Flight related, because this is the third book of that theme this year. But it is very good. It's very short, you know, but to be fair, I wouldn't actually say it's a fast-paced read, because it is a history book essentially. So, you know, take your time with it. But he goes through this concept of the Witch's Sabbath and the folklore behind it, and also talks about Andrew Chumbley traditional witchcraft traditions that sort of heavily used the sort of concept of the Witch's Sabbath in its development and sort of core beliefs, stuff like that. Very interesting. Yeah, the next book I read this year, which again I think was another book club in my Discord read, and it was Cartomancy in Folk Witchcraft, Divination, Magic and Lore by Roger J. Horn. And this is the first edition. He's actually released a revised edition since I read this, so if you are interested in this book, maybe check out the updated version. So I can't speak for that version, but this we read, and I think collectively we really enjoyed it. This is again another really short but sweet read, and this changed my witchcraft practice or divination practice so much. I now pretty much jump to cartomancy, like playing cards cartomancy rather than tarot, and this book is the reason for it. It is such a good guide, like a chapbook style, just teaching you the basics and going through like fun spreads, meanings of the cards, and even like stuff for magic, like sigil making and using in spells. And it's really quick read and it tells you so much. Such a good book. And honestly, I usually keep this by like my altar or like by my playing cards, which I've actually placed up here for some reason. I keep them together, so if I'm doing a quick reading, I could just pop the book in case I'm feeling insecure about my understanding of the cards, blah blah blah. Like, it's just so handy. And anyone who is interested in playing cards and using them in magic and divination, I really recommend go for this one, because as well as the people who are really into tarot and maybe struggle with the minor arcana, getting this book I think can really help you with understanding the minor arcana better, because it is the sort of fundamentals of that, if that makes sense. So love this. And you know, it's Roger J. Horn, I love his work, so there you go. So the next book which I read, I don't have a lot to say about it because honestly it was such a lengthy read that I did actually skim through quite a bit of it, and it is The Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet, a 17th century London cunning man's book of charms, conjurations and prayers by, well, edited by David Rankine, but it's a grimoire essentially. And this grimoire is, as the title says, from the 17th century, and includes material from the Heptameron, Arbatel, Discovery of Witchcraft, and writings from Agrippa and William Bacon. So it's sort of like a amalgamation of different passages from different older grimoires. Yes, so a lot of it in here is working with psalms, working with angelic spirits, sort of classic grimoire stuff you'd expect to see in here, and working with saints. So a lot of that Christian sort of theology themed magic in here as well. It is very interesting, but it is definitely something which, you know, you're not gonna read in like a day. So yeah, it is certainly interesting to have on the shelf. I really sort of need to go back through it, but there are some interesting rituals in here. I guess it is an insight into a particular sort of typical cunning man's practice from the olden days would look like, you know, the use of grimoires and how much that actually was a part of the local cunning man's practice. So, you know, I think it is certainly interesting to think about people back in the day, magical practitioners that did have access to these tomes and these texts, and how they sort of used them for their magical practice for certain things. So, you know. The next book that I read through Scribd is The Gods of the Celts by Miranda Aldhouse Green. And this was a very interesting book. I think I read this because I wanted to get a better insight into the different deities of the Celtic peoples and how I guess they varied regionally. So this book, if I remember correctly, went through a lot of the continental Gaulish Celt gods, which I thought was quite interesting, and she did also touch on the sort of Brythonic deities as well, which obviously, as you guys know, is my jam. So I did learn a lot in this book. I wouldn't say it's the best book out there, but I think if I had a physical copy to go through and sort of refer back to, it might be better. So I can't really give a proper rating or recommendation, but it did help me get some insight into sort of how much the gods of the Celts sort of travelled with the people, you know, as they moved. Because obviously people sort of think about the Celtic people as this one sort of culture, but that's not true. There were so many different tribes and the gods varied regionally, very much so. So when we're looking at like the gods of the Celts or like the Celtic pantheon, it's sort of a misnomer. It's not really that true, because the Celtic gods are just so distinct based on location and culture. So it did give me that sort of understanding much better, so, you know. But moving on to the next book, it was The Path of Paganism by John Beckett. Now, I really want to do a beginner pagan book recommendations video, so I probably will talk about more pagan books in a bit more depth when I do that video eventually. But I really did like this book, and I think again it's one of those books I want a physical copy of so I can go back to, because I read the audiobook of this and I'm terrible with retaining audiobook information. Like, yeah, I'm just really terrible. I need the physical copy to be able to reference through. But I did remember really liking this book. There was some stuff which I didn't fully agree with, but you know, I think that is the case with a lot of books. You know, you're never gonna read something and believe 100% of everything, that because pagan paths, witchcraft, spirituality, it's all so personal, and we're always gonna have things that we don't agree on, so you know, whatever. But I did like it. I remember really liking it. I remember it being something which, you know, like if I was younger and if I had something which sort of plainly described what paganism is, or like a pagan path is, it would like have helped me out so much better. I remember like reflecting on a lot of like that whilst I read the book, so you know. But I'll get a physical copy and maybe like go through it a bit better and talk to you guys about it more. The next book I read was again through Scribd, and it is Welsh Witchcraft by Mara Starling, and I absolutely loved this book. So good, and I really recommend it if you are interested in Welsh folk magic, Welsh witchcraft, Welsh paganism, folklore and folk magic. If you are interested in Wales as a country, I really recommend it. Mara Starling is fabulous. I'm sure you've heard of her. She is absolutely great. She's so lovely, and she did a really good job of this book, and I really want to get a physical copy because there was just so much interesting tidbits in there, and I would love to just have it on my shelf, to be honest, because it was such a good book. Really recommend it. I don't see a lot of Welsh sort of pagan or witchcraft books, so it's really nice that there is something like this out there, because a lot of people look at like the UK and forget about like individual countries and cultures and how they can really vary. So I think it's nice to have something which is very distinct and showing how distinct it is, you know. So, but yeah, I really recommend it, and I think I did a review of it for patrons, so if you're interested in maybe a bit more of what the book is about and details, go maybe check out my Patreon page. The next book I read is Blood of Brujeria by Alexis Arredondo and Eric Labrado. So this book, I believe, is a follow-up to their book Magia, which I read last year. So I was very much excited to read this, and it is a lot more spicy, I guess, and there's a lot more sort of brujeria focused aspects to sort of Mexican folk magic. So, you know, talking about like curses and defense protection magic, there's very interesting stuff in here. So I would recommend it to get an insight into what a more distinct witchcraft, you know, magical practice is like from your typical English-centered witchcraft or magical practice paths. I think it's very interesting, and I love Conjure South publications because, you know, written by people from the community, from the culture, and you get like an actual like native insight. So the next book I read was called The Revolutionary Genius of Plants by a name that I cannot remember, Stefano Mancuso. There you go, that's what it was. And I did speak about this book in a plant magic video I did, and I really liked it. I think, unfortunately, I think it's quite hard to get, but it's on Scribd. I've wanted to get a hardback, like a physical copy of it, but they only have it in hardback. It is super expensive, so it's like, But it was really interesting to see how intelligent plants are. A lot of the time when people look at or think about plants, they just think about, you know, just stuff you see on the ground, and you don't think of it as something which is really intelligent in its adaptation to the environment, its evolution. It's just so fascinating, and it really changed the way I practice my animistic sort of, or like my animist beliefs, because, you know, it's just amazing the sort of research that they go through that in that book. So really do recommend it if anyone sort of fancies a interesting ecology sort of nature book. I loved this one. The next book that I read this year was called Magic by Brandy Williams, and we read this for our book club, and it was a bit 50-50. I can't really remember. I really liked it because it helped me with like actually incorporating things like string magic, cord magic, you know, magic using like simple knots and like bracelets and necklaces, sort of things like that. Because, you know, I learned new ways to make cords, for example, and for that alone it was actually really nice because that is sort of very folk magic-y, so I really did like it for that. There was some other stuff in there which I was kind of like, is that really true though? Like there was a line something like, all witches worship a goddess or something like that, and I was just like, I don't think that's really that true, but anyway. There were some things like that which clearly are from like biased from the author's practice, which aren't really true if you're saying it as like a generalized statement. But you know what, as a book which goes through cord magic, so a lot of knot magic, a lot of colour magic, and some basic correspondences in there, which is good for any beginner. You learn how to make cords. It gave me a lot of inspiration for my practice, and you know, growing up I used to love making bracelets, so now I've sort of been using that to make sort of knot magic bracelets, and something which is very like beginner friendly, especially if you are someone who doesn't want to be very open about their practice and just very crafty, then actually like making knot magic, cord magic is very accessible for you. So yeah, actually quite liked it, but you know, it's one of those books you say you like and then have a bit of caveat to it, but I did like it. The next book I read is Cunning Folk and Familiar Spirits by Emma Wilby. Now I did a detailed review of this for patrons, so I really won't go through it that much here because it is a big academic book. I spoke about it on my Essential English Folk Magic video as well, so if you, my Essential English Folk Magic books video, so if you want to watch that and see what I say, then maybe watch that as well. It's one of those really influential books for traditional witchcraft, folk witchcraft, spirit flight, familiar spirits, all that sort of stuff. I think it is very interesting. She raises a lot of good points, because, you know, it's one of those academic books where although she's not a practitioner, she argues basically the practitioner angle. So that's interesting for an academic book, but yeah, I did really like it, of course, and there are definitely some caveats, starting with the use of the term shaman, but you know, that's just a whole thing I can't get into in this video because it would just be way too long. But yeah, very interesting book. The next book I read after this is The Mountain and the Stream, Rural Animism and Pagan Practices by Paul Pearson and Talis Harrell. So this one was actually very, very interesting. Independently published, I believe, and they both go through basically their experiences of living in very like rural area in Italy, meeting like local practitioners and learning from them basically, and local practitioners in Cheshire. So because it is more of like them telling a story, whether or not you believe them is like another thing, but you know what, it was very, very insightful, and I feel like you could play a drinking game with how much I say interesting, but it really was interesting to hear these perspectives and looking at this concept of like non-Wiccan like witchcraft, like ancient traditions, so you know. But hearing about the, you know, local practices that they talked about from the people that they met, I thought was at least fun to read. So not sure I'd recommend it, but I don't unrecommend it, if that makes sense. I'm very neutral about it, but you know, it was a cool read. So the next book I read this year was an interesting book. This is one we read for book club. and it is Blackthorn's Protection Magic, A Witch's Guide to Mental and Physical Self-Defense by Amy Blackthorn. Now, I am so sorry, Amy Blackthorn, but I just did not like this book at all. It's something which I actually spoke about on my Patreon video, which was witchcraft books I do not recommend. This was one of them, and if you want to know more about what I say, about why I don't recommend it, please go check out my Patreon, because I say it all in that video. But in short, this is a book about protection magic, right? But there is actually advice in here which can get you in like not only like physical like harm, like physical trouble and like mental health trouble, but also like legal trouble, and it's extremely US centered, which I guess is expected by someone who lives in the US, but even the advice like within the US would be dangerous. So I really like wouldn't want people to actually follow some of the advice in here, and to be honest, like there's not a lot of good magic like advice in here either, so yeah, I like just don't recommend it. Please go check my video if you want to know more, but yeah, well, I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry. I have to move on. The next book I read actually was Consorting with Spirits by Jason Miller. Now, the minute I saw this like announced, I was obsessed. I wanted to read it, like, and I haven't even got a physical copy, but I'm gonna get one. And Jason Miller, I love his books. I've loved his other ones that I've read, and this one I was so excited for, and you know, it did not disappoint. I absolutely loved it. I think there was, of course, a lot more ceremonial spirit work bias, but he does talk about all sorts of spirits and does give context for a lot of them, and it was just so interesting, and really did like it. And something like spirit work is so hard to condense in a 101 book. How can you really? Like, spirits, working with spirits is just so complex, and something which is so individual as an experience as well. So it's so hard to make a book in a 101, especially given there's so many spirits that exist, so many types of spirits, particularly pertaining to different traditions as well. So it's an impossible book to write, really, but I think he does it so well, and I do really recommend it. The next book I read this year was The Book of Spells by Ella Harrison, and this is such a lovely book. Ella, if you're watching, I don't know if you do, but if you're watching, I absolutely loved it. It's so good. And you know what? There are a lot of 101 books, there are a lot of simple like beginner spell books, and I really rate this one. It's not only is it so pretty, the illustrations in here are divine, but the spells in here are really nice, they're really varied, and there's so many different like goals, like intentions. So I actually really rate this book. For anyone who wants to get like a book that, and you're more a beginner, and you know, you're maybe not really like sure of what particular path or tradition to go down, this book, I think I really do recommend it. It's a really nice beginner book, lots of really cool ideas, and you know, it's just so gorgeous. You know, it's just something which could sit on a coffee table and you just read it over and over again. So lovely. So definitely love this book, 5-star. The next book that I read was The Visions of Spaewife, The History and Practice of Fortune Telling, Modern Practitioners in Scotland and Spaewife's book by Ash William Mills. This book I did really like. It includes old chapbooks from the 19th century. There's like a picture of them and like a, well, not a translation, but you know, it's just like in text, so it's easier to read. So it is very interesting for that, you know, especially if you're interested in maybe more Scottish folklore and magic and divination more specifically. So as someone who was developing my playing card cartomancy, I really wanted to read it because, you know, it was just very, very interesting. And there's like a little section with interviews of different practitioners, so this was very lovely. I did like it. The next book that I read was The Sorcerer's Secret: Strategies in Practical Magic by Jason Miller. And again, another Jason Miller book. Really like this one. I would say it's a bit dated though. We had a lot of caveats, I think, with this book. There's some stuff in here which I think is very like but you know, it was published quite a while ago, wasn't it? In 2008, I think, which is so long ago now, and that upsets me. Like, that's just mad. But there are some practices in here which are actually quite useful, especially when he's talking about like subtle keys, like subtle magic, and regular practice. But I would be critical when you're reading it. I'm not sure if I'm misremembering, but I'm pretty sure he's revising this book, like updating it, so that might be worth, if you are interested in this book, maybe wait a little bit, see if my hunch is correct and he is revising it. But you know, I think his work is always very insightful and I did really like it, but there were a lot of caveats. But yeah. The next book, coming to the end of the list, but the next book that I read this year was Bringing Race to the Table: Exploring Racism in the Pagan Community by, again, it's another collection of authors, but these are the people who edited it: Crystal Blanton, Taylor Elwood, and Brandy Williams. So this book is fantastic. I will do a video next year talking about this book and some others, so stay tuned for that video. But again, another collection of essays all going through different topics relating to intersectionality, diversity, issues such as racism, and it is so insightful. It is such an important book, and it's split into different sections. So there's a collection of essays on people of colour's experience of racism. So again, very similar to Minority Voices and Paganism books. So there's actual like experiences from the people themselves, and there's a collection of essays all about like historical and mythological racism, which I thought was very, very interesting. So the ones I particularly liked was White Privilege in Thelema by Zach Anderson. I really liked Whitewashing on the Altar by Brandy Williams. I really also liked the concept of marketing rad trad, so how there is a co-influence between paganism and the alt-right and the rise of right-wing beliefs and influences in neo-paganism. Very eye-opening and very true, unfortunately. And then the last section is a bunch of essays on being an ally. So I think this was such an important book. I recommend everyone to read it, honestly. It's just so good. And yeah, I'll definitely talk about it more at length in the future video, but 5-star book, so important. The next book that I read is Queering Your Craft: Witchcraft from the Margins by Cassandra Snow. And we read this for book club. I think it was the last public book club I've done on my Discord channel, and it wasn't super great, to be honest. I really wanted to like it as a queer person myself. I really wanted to like it, but I just didn't think it did what it needed to do. My experience of reading it was reducing queer identity to like sparkles and trauma, and I don't think that's entirely accurate. I think obviously trauma is something which a group of people can collectively bond about and, you know, relate to each other, and of course it is one of those things which is a common and shared experience, but I don't think it defines what being queer means. So there was a few things like that which I didn't entirely love, but I wouldn't say it's a god-awful book. So yeah, if anyone's interested in my thoughts more, maybe join my Discord server and read up in my book club channel a bit, because we spoke about it quite a lot. So yeah, unfortunately, of all the sort of intersectionality witchcraft books I read, I wouldn't rate that super highly. But one that I would rate very highly is the last book that I read this year, called The Modern Craft: Powerful Voices on Witchcraft Ethics, edited by Claire Askew and Alice Tarbuck. So this is a very recent release. I think it's got released this year actually, and I bought it and I absolutely loved it. Another collection of essays, all from different sort of people, from different marginalised groups essentially. There's a lot of interesting essays in here, stuff that's really insightful, stuff that will help you give it different perspectives. So some essays I really liked was Lilith Dorsey's one on the ethics and world of African traditional religions. So they talk about how, you know, demonized and how stereotyped ATRs are and the reality of what ATRs actually are. I thought it was really interesting, something which needs to be talked about more. There's a really good essay on the sort of decolonization of witchcraft from indigenous religions. I thought that was really good as well. And yeah, there was just so many good essays in here, and again it looks really pretty as well. It's quite an accessible read. But again, with all of these anthology books, they need like time to really process the information, but so good. And again, I will talk about it in a future video at length. So yeah, those are the books that I read this year, and I thought obviously the year isn't over, so I'll go through the books I'm currently reading, which is The Witch's Devil by Roger J. Horne, another Roger J. Horne book, and I will talk about this in a future video, but I of course absolutely love it. I'm going through the audiobook of The Witch's Guide to the Paranormal by J. Alan Cross. It's very interesting, not necessarily my field or approach to spirit work, but you learn something new. And I think I'm also going through, let me get up, Sacred Gender, Create Trans and Non-Binary Spiritual Connections by Ariana Serpentine. And I'm really liking that book so far, but yes, I'll talk more about those in the future, but those are what I'm reading so far. And yeah, I didn't count, but that's 20 odd books, much less than last year, but to be honest, I think it's been quite nice. I've been able to focus more on like each individual book, and yeah, I did aim to get to 30, but I didn't get there unfortunately. But yeah, what did you read this year? Was it anything good? And I think for next year I want to read at least 20. That's what I'm setting myself, because I don't need to hit 70 anymore. Like, I just don't have the time. I don't know how I had the time before, but I think I'm okay with 20. But there's a lot of exciting books coming out. I'm still trying to get through stuff on my shelf. So, oh yeah, another book I'm reading is The Altar Within by Juliet Diaz. I forgot to mention that, but yeah. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope it's not too long. I did try and make this more concise than the other one, but yeah. Thank you for watching. If you got to the end, let me know down below, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.